It was late summer the year Lila disappeared. The rain had just started light enough that the pavement hissed when it hit. I looked out the window and saw her standing there barefoot at the edge of our yard holding that red rubber ball. She was staring down the street like she saw something I couldn't. I called her name. She turned, gave a little nod, bent to grab the ball, and vanished. No scream, no sound. Just the gate swinging closed behind her, and a silence I've never unheard. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and tap that like and subscribe if you believe no child should ever go missing without someone still fighting to bring them home. Every click helps another name stay in the light. My name is Janine Holloway. I was 42 back then, and I've lived in Savannah my whole life. Born here, raised here, married Ray. Here raised both our girls on Whitaker Street. Our house sat just a block and a half from the river. You could hear the tugboats some nights when the wind blew right. We weren't rich, but we were rooted. Church on Sundays, fried chicken on Friday's porch, sitting every evening when it wasn't too hot. Back then I believed in order. Not just rules, but the quiet kind, bedtime's front porch lights, who you waved to on your block and who you didn't. I believed children should feel safe walking barefoot through grass. And until that August, they did. The summer Lila turned 7, we still had those kinds of days. The kind where cicadas droned so loud it felt like the air itself was humming. Maisie was just learning to talk, and Lila was the kind of big sister who'd help her carry stuffed animals up the stairs one at a time. That day, she'd been playing outside with the red ball we bought her from the hardware store on Habersham. She was wearing a sundress with little yellow flowers and that silver butterfly necklace she'd begged for on her birthday. I remember the air being sticky, the kind of sticky that settles into your skin and stays. Spanish moss hanging like cobwebs from the trees, and the smell of honeysuckle and wet wood baking together in the heat. Everything about it felt so normal. Almost too normal. I'd felt it earlier that week, a pressure behind my eyes, a kind of heaviness in the air like the storm was waiting for permission. Lila had started asking strange questions too. Nothing alarming, just odd for a child her age. She asked if people ever forget where home is, if butterflies can find their way back if they fly too far. I chalked it up to books or a story she'd heard in church. Kids get ideas in their heads, but looking back now, I wish I'd asked where those thoughts were coming from. We had neighbors who waved, but not many who lingered. There was always that feeling on Whitaker like people kept one curtain cracked just enough to watch without being seen. One of those was Elias Monroe. He lived 2 doors down in the house with the broken porch light. Always polite, always quiet. I never thought much of him. But that week I noticed he'd installed something on the corner of his house. A small black dome. Maybe a security camera, maybe not. When Ray asked him, Elias just said he'd had trouble with raccoons. That night I was frying chicken in the kitchen when I realized the cicadas had gone quiet. I looked up. Through the window I saw Lila standing at the edge of our yard, one hand on the gate, the other clutching her ball. Her head was tilted slightly like she was listening. I wiped my hands on a towel and called her name again. She didn't move at first. Then, just as I stepped toward the door, she bent down, unlatched the gate, and stepped out into the street. That's when I felt it, that something had shifted, that we had crossed into a place we couldn't come back from. The screen door banged once behind me, not hard, just enough to rattle the tension out of the hinges. I stepped off the porch, still holding the dish towel in one hand, and called her name again. No answer. The street was quiet in that eerie way it gets just before a storm. Cicadas gone, still porch lights buzzing. Our front gate was swung open, barely moving in the thick air, and the red rubber ball lay just beyond it, already darkening with spots of rain. I looked both ways down Whitaker Street, past the iron balconies and sagging porch rails, and saw nothing. No movement, no shadow. Just the distant blink of the Riverport's warning light, blinking in slow, steady rhythm like a heartbeat I couldn't sync to. I walked down to the sidewalk in bare feet, feeling the warm grit of it, the sudden coolness where the first droplets had landed. Still no Lila. I said her name again, louder this time, trying to keep my voice calm. A dog barked somewhere down the block, then went quiet. I stood there frozen between our fence and the slow bend in the street, thinking maybe she'd followed the ball and was just out of sight. Maybe she was crouched behind the neighbor's hydrangeas. Maybe she was being silly, playing some version of hide and seek. That's what I told myself as I ran down one direction and then the other, calling her name over and over until my voice cracked. Within minutes, Ray was in the truck, circling the block windows down, headlights off. We searched every yard, every porch, every garden shed. The Holloways weren't the kind of family that waited around to see if something was serious. Lila didn't wander. Lila didn't disobey like that. And it was less than 10 minutes between me seeing her at the fence and finding that empty stretch of sidewalk. 10 minutes that now feel longer than the entire life I've lived since. The police showed up fast. One squad car, then another. A K-9 unit from the next county came in just before midnight. They asked me what she was wearing. They asked if she'd been upset that day, if Ray and I had been fighting, if she had a favorite place to hide. I answered every question as best I could, sitting on the porch steps, still in my apron, my fingers wringing the edge of that towel until it tore. Abigail slept through most of it. She was too little to understand. I remember watching one of the officers walk into our yard and step over that ball like it meant nothing. The dog sniffed it once, then moved on. By sunrise, they'd brought in volunteers, people from our church, a few teachers from her elementary school. A local contractor loaned his drone for the search. They combed the banks of the river, the trails behind the cemetery, even the storm drains along Habersham. Nothing. No shoe. No hair ribbon. No drag marks. Not a single thing left behind but that red ball, and a story that wouldn't make sense no matter how many times we told it. The first few days were a blur. Every time a car slowed near the house, I'd stand up. Every time the phone rang, I'd lunge for it. Reporters camped across the street. They filmed me standing by the mailbox. They filmed Ray carrying Abigail out to the truck one morning just so we could get a moment away from the noise. Lila's photo went out everywhere. The butterfly pendant showed clearly in one of them, the one from her birthday, where she's smiling with cake on her chin. That image got printed on flyers, stapled to telephone poles, taped in store windows. But as the days passed and no calls came, the cameras packed up and the questions turned cold. They started looking at us then. Not officially, but you could feel it. One officer asked if we had any trouble with money. Another wanted to know who had keys to the house. When they searched the basement a second time, I caught one of them taking photos of the utility shelf like maybe a bucket of paint held the answer. I didn't blame them. Who else was there to suspect Elias Monroe moved out that fall? No note, no forwarding address, just a truck that came early one morning, and by noon his porch was empty. He'd always been polite, waved when he saw us, offered to help Ray replace a piece of fencing once, but never invited anyone inside. Never had folks over. There were whispers that he'd been seen walking along the river some nights. One neighbor said she saw him burning something in a barrel out back the week Lila went missing. But when the cops checked, there was nothing left but ash and a few crushed soda cans. Elias wasn't arrested. Wasn't even brought in as far as I know. He just left. Took the quiet with him. And the house stayed empty. For years, no one would buy it. Listing signs rotted in the yard. Rain peeled the paint in long strips down the siding. Grass grew knee-high by the second summer. I'd cross the street to avoid walking past it when I pushed Maisie in the stroller. But still, sometimes, when I couldn't sleep, I'd find myself at the front window just watching that porch waiting for something to change. One evening, maybe a year after the search had ended, I went up to the attic to find an old box of winter coats. I found myself digging through a smaller box marked LH in Ray's handwriting. Inside were birthday cards, school crafts, a photograph she'd drawn of our family, the stick figure kind, all in bright crayon lines. On the back she'd scribbled, "Me Mom, Dad Maisie, Scout," Scout was our dog. He'd died the year before she vanished. I sat with that drawing for a long time. I remember thinking how strange it was that someone could vanish completely, and yet pieces of them stayed behind in the most ordinary ways. After a while, even the pieces stopped showing up. The clothes still smelled like her for a while, then they didn't. The voicemail I kept of her singing got corrupted on an old phone. Ray stopped talking about her out loud, though he never took her photo down from over the fireplace. And Maisie, she grew into the role of only child without ever meaning to. She carried it like a shadow, like she knew better than to ask too many questions. Then one night, 13 years after that gate swung open, I was setting the table radio low just like it had been that night. The porch steps creaked, not the way they do in the wind, heavier, timed, like a person. I looked toward the door, expecting Ray, but it wasn't him. A woman stood just beyond the screen, tall and thin, her sweater hanging loose on her frame. Her hair was dark and pulled back. Her face was pale, but her eyes, those were the same. Her hand rested against the door frame like it was the only thing holding her upright. And around her neck hung a tarnished silver butterfly pendant. She said one word. Mom. And I dropped the plate in my hands. I didn't move at first. I just stood there with pieces of a broken plate around my feet, staring through the screen like maybe I'd imagined her. Maybe I was just tired enough or desperate enough to dream her up. But the screen door creaked open and stayed that way, and the woman on the porch didn't vanish. She stepped inside slow and unsure, her eyes scanning the house like every corner held a memory she wasn't ready to meet. Ray came in from the hallway a second later, still holding his phone. His face didn't change. He just stopped in the doorway, stared at her for a long time, then said, "What's your name?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at me, then down at the butterfly pendant around her neck, and finally said, "It's me. I'm Lila." The sound of that name, her name spoken out loud after 13 years, it felt like time cracked in half right there in the living room. Ray didn't speak. He walked past her, slow and quiet, and sat down in the armchair across from where she stood. I could see the way his jaw clenched, the muscles in his cheek twitching. He looked at her the way someone looks at a painting that might be a forgery, searching for whatever was off. "If you're Lila," he said, "what was the name of your first dog?" She didn't flinch. "Scout," she said. "He used to sleep under my bed, but sometimes he snored and you'd make him leave the room." Her voice was thin, dry, but steady. That should have been the moment we all collapsed into tears. But Ray didn't move. He just kept looking at her quiet, waiting for something he couldn't explain. Maisie stood at the edge of the hallway holding her phone like she didn't know whether to call someone or record what was happening. She was 15 now, almost the same age Lila had been when she vanished. She stared at this older girl, this stranger, and I could see it hit her. This wasn't just a reunion. This was something else. Something none of us knew how to carry. We sat at the table like we were guests in our own home. The radio was off. The air felt thick like it hadn't moved in hours. I reheated dinner, but none of us ate more than a few bites. Lila, if I'm honest, I was still saying it silently, testing it in my own head, picked at the food like she hadn't eaten in a while, but couldn't stomach it now. Her sweater slipped off one shoulder at one point, and that's when I saw them faint scars along her upper arm. Thin, silvery lines. She noticed me noticing and pulled the fabric back up without saying a word. I didn't ask. When she spoke, it wasn't like telling a story. It was more like answering questions we hadn't asked out loud. She said she'd been far from here. Said she'd lived with people who wouldn't let her leave. Said she wasn't ready to talk about how she got out. Her voice stayed steady, but there were pauses, long, careful ones, like she was sorting every word before it crossed her lips. I listened, but I also watched her eyes. They were the same ones I used to kiss goodnight. Same shape, same color, but duller now, like they'd seen too much in the dark. She looked around the house like someone walking through a museum of their own childhood. Her gaze stopped on the clock above the mantel, the old school photos near the bookshelf, the spot on the floor that creaked when you stepped just right. But nothing brought relief. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. And when the silence got too long, she said so quietly I almost missed it. I used to picture this moment every night. I just didn't think it would hurt this much. After she went to bed, my old sewing room now made up with clean sheets and her favorite quilt, I sat at the kitchen table long after the light outside faded. Ray paced. He didn't want to say what he was thinking, but I knew. He didn't trust it. He didn't trust her. Or maybe he didn't trust himself to believe it. The next morning, word spread fast. You can't keep something like that quiet in Savannah. A neighbor dropped off a casserole before noon. A woman from church came by just to say hi, but her eyes kept darting past me, trying to catch a glimpse. I caught someone snapping a photo from the sidewalk. We didn't answer the phone, didn't return texts. The only person I let in was my sister Mary. She sat with me for an hour without saying much, just held my hand and kept glancing toward the stairs. And then, little things started standing out. Things I didn't know how to name. That night I found Lila standing in the hallway, staring at her old bedroom door. We'd left it untouched for 13 years. Pink curtains, stuffed animals lined neatly on the bed, the same bookshelf still full of children's stories. She didn't go in, just stood there with one hand on the doorframe. When she finally did step inside, she went straight for an old copy of Charlotte's Web, the one with a torn corner near the spine. She used to call it her lucky book, always read from that copy and no other. And when she reached for it now, her fingers landed on the exact tear without hesitation. That should have reassured me. But instead, it unsettled something. I couldn't say why. Later that week, Maisie found her sitting cross-legged on the bed, holding the butterfly pendant between her fingers, rubbing it like a stone. "Do you remember me?" Maisie asked, so quiet I only heard about it later. Lila looked up and said, "You used to carry a yellow blanket everywhere. You called it Banjo." Wouldn't let Mom wash it. Maisie hadn't mentioned that blanket in years. We thought she'd forgotten. But Lila remembered, and still there were questions. A local grocer swore he'd seen her a few months back in a small town outside Macon. I asked her about it gently. She shook her head and said no. "I've never been there." Her tone left no room to push. One morning, Ray walked into the kitchen before sunrise and found her sitting at the table alone, staring out the window. He told me later her lips were moving, like she was whispering. He couldn't hear the words at first. Then she said a name, Monroe. Ray didn't say anything to her, just stood there in the doorway listening. When she noticed him, she jumped a little, grabbed the pendant again. He asked who she was talking to. She said no one and left the room. But that name stuck with him. Elias Monroe, the man who lived 2 doors down, the man who moved away right after she vanished. That evening, Ray brought it up over dinner. "Do you remember anyone from the neighborhood?" he asked. Lila paused her fork halfway to her mouth. "Just a few faces," she said. "Not names." "What about the night you disappeared?" I asked. "Do you remember what happened?" She set the fork down, slowly. "I remember the rain starting," she said. "I remember dropping my ball. And then someone called my name." Her voice cracked just slightly at the end. "Do you remember who it was?" I asked. She didn't answer for a long time, just looked at the table, then shook her head. "No," she said, "just a voice." Ray watched her the whole time, didn't blink. And when he looked at me afterward, his face said what he wouldn't say out loud, that he didn't believe her. The next morning I found her in the living room. She didn't hear me come in. She was writing something on the back of an old envelope using one of Maisie's school pens. When I got close enough, I saw the words, "Basement key, Monroe. Don't forget. She folded the paper before I could say anything and slid it into her pocket. Then she looked up at me calm as ever and said, "Do we still have that old ladder in the shed?" And I just nodded like I hadn't seen anything at all. Ray didn't say anything about the note Lila had written. Not to me, not right away, but I knew something shifted that day. He moved quieter around her, watched her a little longer when she wasn't looking. He'd always been a man who measured twice before speaking once, and now he was measuring everything the way her voice caught when she said our street name, how her eyes lingered on the stairwell like she expected it to lead somewhere else. At night, I could hear him get up, walk the house in slow loops. Sometimes I'd find him standing at the back window staring down the line of fences, his hand resting on the windowsill like he needed to feel the frame to keep from drifting. Lila noticed too, I think. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just started waking up earlier, sitting in the living room before the sun came up, always holding that pendant, turning it between her fingers like she was waiting for it to tell her what came next. The air in the house felt strange. Not heavy like grief, lighter but more brittle, like if you breathed too hard it might crack. The only person who seemed untouched by it all was Maisie, but even that was a lie. She wore her confusion like a second skin kept close quiet, always listening. She started asking to walk to school alone even though she never had before. Said she just needed space. Said she was fine. But I caught her watching Lila the same way Ray did, like she couldn't quite make the pieces line up. One night I found her at the kitchen table with the old laptop, the one we used for tax returns and recipes. She didn't hear me at first. I stood behind her and saw she was scrolling through a message board called Low Country Watch. It was an old Savannah forum mostly used by retirees, night shift workers, and people who like to swap stories about strange happenings. She clicked into a thread titled Yard Sale at Monroe's boxes marked H and A. I leaned closer. "Maisie," I said, and she jumped a little, clicked the tab closed too fast. "Where'd you find that?" She hesitated. "I was just curious," she said. "Did we ever mark any boxes like that H and A?" I shook my head. "No. Never sold anything from your rooms." She nodded slow, but I could see the gears turning behind her eyes. She didn't push, just shut the laptop and went to bed. But the next morning she asked if we still had the key to the old tool shed. That's when I knew something had taken hold of her too. Ray stayed quiet until Friday. Then he walked in with a small envelope in his hand, sat down across from me at the table. "I found it," he said. "Found what? The key. One of mine. I labeled it basement." He opened the envelope and inside was a brass key taped to an index card. His handwriting was still sharp and neat like it always had been when he was younger. He didn't say anything else, just stared at it like it was a photo of someone who used to live here. "You think it's for Monroe's place?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. But she wrote the word. Basement. Then she wrote his name, and she said, "Don't forget." That was when he made the call. Not to the local precinct, he called Detective Sam Green. Sam had been the first officer on our case 13 years earlier. He'd retired a few years back, but stayed in town. I don't know how Ray got a hold of him, but the next day there, he was standing on our porch. Same worn coat, same tired eyes. He didn't hug me, didn't shake hands, just nodded once and stepped inside like no time had passed at all. He brought the original case binder with him. Thick, creased metal rings rusted where sweat and time had gotten to them. He laid it flat on the dining room table and opened it to a familiar photo, Monroe at a neighborhood barbecue paper plate in one hand, a stiff smile that never quite reached his eyes. Sam didn't ask about Lila, not right away. He asked about the key, about the note, about how we'd been sleeping. I told him the truth, or at least the part of it I could say out loud. That evening, Sam asked Lila if she'd walk with him and Ray back down the block. It was dusk. The air smelled like river silt and old leaves. Lila wore that same gray sweater sleeves pushed to her elbows. She didn't speak much on the walk, just pointed when she needed to. At the cracked sidewalk, at the bent gate latch, at Monroe's house. The porch sagged a little more than I remembered. Paint peeled off in thick curls. The contact number on the for sale sign was faded to almost nothing. Lila stopped on the sidewalk and said, "It still smells like it did." Ray asked, "Smells like what?" She didn't turn to look at him. Bleach, and dust, and something old underneath. Sam walked up to the side of the house. A narrow path ran along the edge, half covered in vines. At the end of it there was a rusted storm door, low to the ground, the kind that leads to a basement that was never meant to be finished. Sam bent down and saw the outline where a padlock used to be. The metal was cleaner there, fresher, like something had been removed recently, or replaced. Back at the house I couldn't sleep. The porch light buzzed all night. I kept the curtains open just enough to see the edge of our yard where the gate still leaned slightly to one side. The next morning Sam came back with a permission slip from the listing agent. Said they had a window to walk through the property. Just a walkthrough, nothing official yet, but enough to see what was there. Ray held the key in his palm like it was a weight he'd been carrying for years. He slid it into the lock on that basement door, and it turned without hesitation. The door creaked open, stale air rolling out like breath held too long. Lila wasn't allowed to come with us. Sam made that clear. She stood on the sidewalk with her arms crossed, the pendant caught in her fist, watching like if she blinked the truth might disappear again. I didn't go in either, just waited by the curb counting the seconds between steps. When Sam and Ray came back out, their faces were blank. Too blank. I knew better than to ask in front of anyone. Sam just said, "We'll talk tomorrow," and walked back to his car without looking up. That night, Ray left the envelope with the key sitting on the table. He didn't put it away. He didn't say a word. He just sat at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee he never drank, and when I finally asked what was down there, he shook his head and said, "Shelves, tools, tape, and a box labeled neighborhood." Then he looked me dead in the eye and said, "There was a tape, Janine, one marked with our street," and I felt the bottom of everything I'd tried to hold up finally give way. Detective Green came back the next morning early with a pair of gloves tucked in his jacket pocket and a look that said he hadn't slept either. He didn't say much, just nodded to Ray and asked for the key again. The three of them, Ray Green and the listing agent, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, walked into Monroe's house just after 9 a.m. I stayed back with Maisie, but I stood at the window the entire time watching that porch like it might spit something back out. Lila didn't ask to go. She just sat on the couch with both hands in her lap staring at the floor. Her hair was still damp from her shower. The sweater she wore was clean but worn thin at the elbows. The pendant lay flat against her collarbone. I offered her tea. She shook her head no. They were gone a little over an hour. When they returned, Green carried a plastic evidence sleeve tucked inside a canvas folder. Ray looked pale. He didn't speak until we were alone that night, just after Maisie went to bed. He sat at the table and told me about the tape. He said the basement was cold and quiet with rows of old tools and a television set hooked up to a VHS player. There were boxes, some labeled by date, some by vague titles. One of them read, "Whitaker Porch." Inside were tapes all black most with stickers faded from age. Green had chosen one and pressed play. The date on the timestamp was the night Lila disappeared. He told me the footage showed our street from a distance, fixed angle, the kind of wide shot someone might use to check for raccoons, just like Monroe had claimed all those years ago. The first few minutes were nothing wind leaves porch lights flickering in the dark. Then the gate opened. A small figure stepped out, barely visible in the grain. Her, Lila. 7 years old, barefoot, holding that red ball. She looked toward the camera, paused, then took a step forward, and then someone else entered the frame. Smaller than Monroe Ray said. Narrow shoulders, hooded jacket, a scarf blowing lightly in the wind. They turned toward the child, said something. No sound, but you could see the mouth move. Said her name. Lila. She froze. The scarf fluttered. Floral print. White magnolias on a dark background. I stood up when he said that. I didn't mean to. My legs just moved. Magnolias? I asked. Ray nodded slowly. You had one like that? I walked to the coat closet, pulled out the one hanging on the inside hook. This one, I held it out. Ray didn't touch it, just looked at it and said, Yeah. That's it? I'd had that scarf for years. Worn it to church, to Easter brunch, to bake sales and PTA meetings. It was a gift from my sister Mary. Or maybe I'd borrowed it and never returned it. Either way, it had always been mine. I told Ray that. He nodded but didn't say anything. His hands stayed in his lap. Still. Closed. Later that night, I sat with Lila while she folded the laundry I hadn't finished. She handled the clothes like they belonged to someone else. I asked if she wanted to talk. She didn't answer. Just picked up one of Maisie's t-shirts and set it neatly on the pile. I asked if she remembered the night the one on the tape. She didn't look up. Only pieces, she said. Voices. The rain. A smell like bleach and something else. She paused. Tea. I stared at her. Tea. She nodded. There was a kettle, I think. The next day, Green came back. He asked if we still had church directories from back then, photos, group pictures, anything with Monroe or neighbors in it. I pulled 2 binders from the back closet, dusted off the covers. He flipped through them quietly at the kitchen table, 1 page at a time. When he found the photo, he didn't say anything at first. He just turned it toward me. There she was, Mary, my sister, laughing at something off camera, wearing that scarf, the one with the magnolias. I stared at the picture so long the corners started to blur. Green asked, Where was she the night Lila went missing? I didn't answer right away. I closed the binder, folded my hands. She came by that afternoon, said she'd bring dessert for the block party. I don't remember after that. The storm came. Everything got strange. Green didn't press. He just nodded like he'd already guessed as much. We're going to talk to her, he said. We'll be careful. He left soon after, and I sat in the same chair until the sun was down. Ray walked in and stood beside me. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he asked, Do you think she could have done it? I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what it even meant anymore. That night, Lila sat on the porch steps after dinner. It had started to rain again, soft and even. She didn't flinch at the sound. She sat with her back straight, her knees pulled in her fingers, curled around the edge of the step. I stepped out quietly. She didn't look up. After a moment, she said, The voice that called my name. She paused. It sounded like yours. My breath caught. Mine. She nodded. I thought it was you. That's why I walked out. I didn't say anything. I sat beside her and let the rain hit my arms, the wood under us, damp and cold. Somewhere behind us, the refrigerator kicked on. The house glowed with soft light from inside, and down the street I could just barely see Monroe's porch through the trees. Still empty. Still watching. I looked over at her. Her face was calm, but her hands were shaking slightly. What else do you remember? I asked. She didn't answer right away. Then just above a whisper, she said, There was a door. And someone said, It's just for tonight. She looked down at the pendant. But it wasn't. I waited, but she didn't say more. She stood up and went inside, leaving a wet footprint on the step that took longer than I expected to dry. I stayed out there until the rain stopped, until the porch light flickered once, then steadied. I didn't know what was coming next, but I knew we'd crossed into something deeper than memory. Something none of us were going to get out of clean. Green called from the parking lot of St. Agnes. Said he'd just finished talking to the parish administrator and needed me to come down. I left Maisie with a neighbor and made the drive with both hands clenched on the wheel. The rain had let up that morning, but everything still felt heavy. Gutters dripping the sky hung low like it might collapse. I parked next to his cruiser, got out, and followed him to the rectory steps without saying much. Inside, the place was hushed like hospitals. Sometimes are no music, no voices, just the faint tick of an old wall clock and the whir of a desktop computer humming behind the secretary's desk. Green led me down a hallway lined with framed confirmation photos past the sacristy and into a storage room that smelled like candle wax and wet coats. He pointed toward a wire shelf in the back. "She volunteered here," he said. "Your sister. Regularly. 5, maybe 6 months before the block party." I didn't answer, just stared at the boxes lined up under the shelf labeled by event year liturgical season. He pulled one down. "Bulletin Archives," he said. "Take a look." Inside were weekly parish newsletters from the year Lila vanished. Most were unremarkable mass intentions, bake sale reminders, a notice about repairs to the steeple. But then I saw the name. Mary Whitaker. Listed under Children's Ministry. 6 consecutive weeks. Each one said the same thing. Lesson prepared and led by Mary W. That detail might have meant nothing to anyone else, but it landed strange in my chest. My sister didn't teach. She wasn't the type to work with kids. She liked planning, organizing, being the one who dropped off the snacks and checked the clipboard. But teaching, getting down on the floor with first graders, that had never been her way. Green didn't say much while I flipped through the rest, just watched me. When I finally closed the box, he handed me a smaller manila envelope. "We pulled something from Monroe's attic," he said. "Wanted you to see it before we make any calls." I opened the flap and slid out a photograph faded, slightly curled at the edges. It showed a group of children sitting in a circle on a blue carpet, plastic chairs pushed to the side. There were posters on the wall, a felt board. Someone had written "God's Gardeners" in yellow marker on the whiteboard behind them. And in the middle of the group sat Mary, smiling, cross-legged with a hand on a little girl's shoulder. That girl was Lila. I recognized the shirt Lila wore. It was one we'd bought on vacation with a small embroidered sunflower near the hem. I remembered the way she'd always tug at that sunflower when she was nervous. The photo must have been taken only weeks before she disappeared. Maybe less. I looked closer. Mary's face looked different somehow. Not unhappy. Just focused, watchful, like she wasn't fully inside the moment. Green stepped out to take a call, and I stood there with the photo pressed between my hands. I thought about the time Mary came by the house maybe 2 days before the party. She'd brought a pie apple store-bought and left it on the counter without staying. Said she had a thing at church, some prep for the Sunday class. That hadn't struck me as odd at the time. Now I wasn't sure what I'd missed. That night, after putting Maisie to bed, I asked Lila if she remembered anything about church, about Mary being there. She hesitated, then said, "I remember glitter and markers and a smell like dust and lemon." She frowned. "There was a drawer with little stickers. You got one if you were quiet." I asked her who gave the stickers. She said, "Sometimes the lady with the braid, but sometimes your sister." She didn't call her Aunt Mary, just your sister. I didn't correct her. The next morning, Ray found a cardboard box tucked into the back corner of the garage. It had Mary's handwriting on the side, seasonal decorations. We must have moved it there after Mom passed. Inside were the usual things: fake leaves, wreath wire, a set of ceramic pumpkins. But buried underneath was something else, a small zippered pouch. I opened it and felt my stomach turn. Inside were index cards, each one labeled with a date and a name. Most were children's names. Some I recognized from our block, some from church. The handwriting was Mary's. Tight slanted, overly neat. Some cards had descriptions. Likes animals, cries when scolded, allergic to peanut butter. One said quiet, easy to redirect, stays near the door. Green came back to the house that evening. I handed him the pouch. He read a few, then tucked it away without comment. "We're going to bring her in," he said. "Not arrest, just talk." He paused. "You okay with that?" I nodded, though I didn't know what I was agreeing to. He left through the side gate. That night, Lila had trouble sleeping. I heard her pacing the hallway, soft footfalls against the floorboards. At one point, I found her sitting on the kitchen tile back against the fridge, holding a flashlight from the junk drawer. She looked up when I entered, didn't flinch. "The power used to go out," she said quietly, "and we'd sit in the dark until they told us it was morning." I asked who they were. She didn't answer, just clicked the flashlight on and off. I sat beside her. After a few minutes, she said, "Sometimes you'd forget who you were. Not forever, just for a while. Then someone would say your name too loud and it would all come back." I reached over and placed my hand on hers. "What brought it back this time?" I asked. She looked down. "Maisie," she said, when she laughed. It didn't sound like anything bad had ever happened to her. She looked at me then. I wanted that sound to belong to me too. I didn't speak. I just let the silence settle, let her breathing slow, let the room become still again. The next morning, a detective from Green's team called. They'd spoken to Mary. She'd agreed to meet. Not at the station, at her house. Green wanted me there not for the interview, but after, in case anything came up, in case I remembered something she didn't. I said yes. Then I sat at the table with the photo of Mary and Lila still in front of me. And I waited for the day to begin. Mary's house was smaller than I remembered, or maybe just more ordinary. Tan siding, a narrow porch, a garden that had gone to seed. The kind of place you pass a dozen times and never look at twice. Green parked out front and asked if I wanted to wait in the car. I told him no. I didn't want to feel like a visitor in this part of the story. Inside, everything was clean but oddly still. No music, no ticking clock, just the soft whine of the refrigerator and the faint smell of eucalyptus from a candle she'd lit near the sink. Mary was sitting at the table when we walked in, hands folded, hair pulled back tighter than usual. She wore a long sweater, the same one I'd seen her wear to Christmas dinner years ago, and her eyes didn't move much. Just tracked us as we entered, then settled somewhere near the floor. Green introduced himself again and sat down across from her, leaving the seat beside her empty. I stayed standing. She didn't look at me. The first few questions were gentle. When she last saw Lila, whether she remembered volunteering at St. Agnes. She said, yes, of course, her voice small but steady. She talked about craft days, about how the younger kids liked glue sticks and glitter more than actual lessons. Said Lila was quiet but observant. Said she was careful with her scissors, always asked, before taking a second sheet of construction paper. Her voice didn't shake until Green mentioned the photo, the one of her and Lila on the carpet. She didn't ask to see it, just nodded, eyes still down. That was the week before, she said, then stopped. Green didn't rush her, just waited. After a moment, she looked up at him and said, "I didn't mean for it to go on that long." Her voice cracked a little at the edge, but she kept going. She said it started small, just little favors for someone she'd met at a volunteer training. She never gave a full name, just said he was persuasive, said he talked like someone who belonged to every room he entered. She'd wanted to feel useful, she said. Important. That word came out like it surprised her. Green didn't press on the he. Not yet. Instead, he asked what Lila had to do with it. Mary shook her head slowly. Said she hadn't known, not at first. There was a list, she said. A folder passed between hands at a back table during one of those community center meetings. Just kids who might be easier to handle, she said. Quiet ones. ones no one watched too closely. Then her voice went thin. I saw her name, and I didn't take it off. She said she'd tried to steer the man away from Lila, offered up other names, other situations. But something about Lila had stuck. She reminded him of someone Mary whispered. Then she looked at me for the first time. I didn't know where they took her. I swear to God I didn't know. Green asked if she could describe him. The man. She paused, then said he wore khakis and always had clean fingernails. Said he never raised his voice. Said he once complimented the way she folded the church bulletins. He knew how to make you feel seen, she said, and I felt something tighten behind my ribs. She called him Paul. Whether that was a real name or not, she didn't know. Said she hadn't seen him since the month after Lila disappeared. That he vanished before the news broke wide. Left town. No trace. I checked every Sunday after that, she said. Every pew. Every doorway. I thought maybe he'd come back and fix it. Green asked what she meant by fix it. She didn't answer, just wiped her palms on her thighs and asked for a glass of water. I got it for her. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see what her hands did when they held something. When she finished speaking, Green stood slowly and told her she wasn't under arrest, but that a team would be coming by with more questions. She nodded. Didn't argue. Didn't cry. Just asked if she could take the photo with her. He told her no. We walked out into a colder wind than before, the kind that brings leaves off branches all at once. I didn't speak until we reached the car. Then I asked Green what he thought about the man. Paul. He didn't answer right away, just stared at the house behind us, then said, If she's telling the truth, we've got a name. If she's lying, we've got a pattern. I nodded. Then asked what kind of man compliments bulletin folding and disappears children in the same breath. Green didn't have an answer. That night I pulled the index cards back out of the evidence pouch. I looked at each one again, slower this time. There were notes on schedules, behavior, allergies, but on 3 of them, including Lila's, there was a faint check mark in the upper right corner. Not ink. Pencil. Light enough that I hadn't noticed before. I turned Lila's card over. Nothing there. Just the faint pressure mark of that same check from the other side. It felt like a small thing, but it sat wrong with me. The next morning I drove to St. Agnes by myself. I needed to see something for myself. I needed to feel the space. The classroom door was unlocked. Inside, the carpet was new, the walls freshly painted, but the layout hadn't changed. I stood where Mary had been in that photo, turned slowly, and imagined the line of sight from the hallway door. Someone could stand there just outside view and see everything. I walked the path back toward the rear exit. That one had a broken latch once. I remembered hearing about it in passing years back when the maintenance list went around the parish council. I checked the knob. Fixed now. But it hadn't always been. On the drive home, I passed a house with blue shutters and a porch swing that creaked in the wind. For a moment, I thought I saw Lila there, sitting with her knees tucked under her, watching the road go by. But it wasn't her. Just a girl with dark hair and a book on her lap. I didn't stop. Just kept going. When I got back, I found Lila and Maisie in the living room building something with blocks. Lila looked up and smiled, tired but real. And I thought she doesn't need to know all of it, not yet. But the next part, I owe her that. I walked into the kitchen, sat down with the list of names from the pouch, and circled the 3 with check marks. Then I picked up the phone. There was one family I remembered, a boy named Caleb who used to live 2 streets over. I hadn't seen them in years, but I remembered his mother's voice, and I remembered what it sounded like when someone realized they weren't the only one. The woman who answered Caleb's family's old number didn't recognize my name, but she knew exactly who Caleb was. Said she was his older sister Erin, and that she'd been the one to file the second missing person report after he never came home from summer art class in '03. Her voice sounded wary at first, then sharper when I told her what I'd found. We talked for 20 minutes. She asked questions that weren't rhetorical things like, was there ever a school counselor involved, and did anyone look into the park district staff? Then she asked if I was with the police. I told her no. I told her I was a parent. She didn't hang up. She just went quiet and then said, he was never shy. He wouldn't have wandered off. I asked if she remembered a woman named Mary involved with the parish. There was a pause. Then she said, she brought cookies the week before. Aaron gave me permission to share her number with Detective Green. After I hung up, I texted him the note about the check marks on the index cards and the potential pattern across the cases. I didn't know what he'd do with it, but I knew it was bigger than just Lila. That same evening, Green called me back. His voice was low-clipped. He said the department had reclassified Lila's file as part of an active investigation involving multiple potential victims. He asked if I could bring the original pouch of items back, and the next morning they needed to be processed formally now. I agreed, but something in his tone made me ask if there'd been a break. He didn't answer directly, just said, we're starting to see the shape of something. The next morning I dropped off the evidence pouch and gave a statement in full this time with an official recorder and another detective in the room. Green stayed quiet most of the time, only nodding occasionally or asking for clarification when the timeline got tight. When I finished, he asked me to wait a few minutes. Said someone from another precinct had just arrived and might want to speak with me. I sat there in the hallway of that building for what felt like forever, watching uniformed officers pass by with folders and coffee and radios clipped to their belts. Eventually, a woman came out, mid-40s, badge clipped to a plain jacket, hair pulled back without pretense. She introduced herself as Detective Moira Ellis. Said she was with a task force out of the neighboring county. Said she'd been working a file from 2007 that was now being cross-checked against mine. A girl named Natalie, 9 years old, last seen walking home from a holiday food drive. I asked if there had been any leads back then. She said no. Just one photo from a distant security camera, too blurry to identify anyone. But she said the girl had been listed in a community sign-up roster for volunteers. I asked who ran the drive. She said it was organized through a joint effort between 3 parishes, one of which was St. Agnes. I felt the air go thin. Detective Ellis asked if I recognized a name, Paul Mercer. I didn't, but she said it anyway, said that was the name listed as the coordinator for volunteer intake at the time. She didn't have a photo yet. Said the record keeping was a mess and most documents had been scanned badly or lost completely. But she did have a phone number from an archived roster, and they were tracing it now. Later that week, Green updated me 2 more cases were now under review, both from nearby towns. One involved a boy named Jonah, last seen in 2005 at a summer literacy camp. The second was a girl, Ava, who vanished after choir rehearsal the same year. In both cases, there had been informal contact with someone calling himself Paul, always with the air of authority but without a consistent title. Sometimes he was a program coordinator, sometimes a volunteer supervisor. Never an employee. Always friendly. Always fading into the background after the fact. At home, I kept things quiet for Lila. She was doing better, more present, more open, but still tired in ways that didn't show in her face, only in the way she sat still too long or flinched when a drawer closed too hard. I didn't ask her about the man. I didn't use the name Paul. I only asked once, gently, if she remembered the place with the red hallway. Her eyes got wide. She nodded, then whispered, "That's where we waited for the van." She didn't say more, and I didn't push. 2 days later, Green called again. His tone was different this time. Urgent. He said they'd matched a partial print from one of the index cards to a known alias. Paul Mercer had used at least 3 variations of his name across different states. Paul Merton, Paul Marlowe, and once just P. Martin. He'd worked short-term contracts for community centers, tutoring non-profits, even a state-run youth mentorship program in Indiana. Each time he stayed under 2 years. Always glowing references, never anything formal in writing. And then he vanished. Green said they had a potential last known address outside of Akron, but it was 15 years old. Still, it was enough to bring in a regional team. They didn't tell me everything, but they didn't have to. I could hear it in their pacing, that shift when a cold file turns into something living again. Something breathing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the floor beside Lila's bed, watching her chest rise and fall under the covers. The dog lay curled near her feet. In the dim light, she looked younger than she was. I remembered the day we bought her that purple jacket, the one she wore on the last day. I remembered how she'd spun in it arms wide and said she felt like a planet. And I thought about the other kids, the ones who hadn't come back. The ones with names on cards that no one had checked. I didn't know if justice was a word that could stretch far enough to hold all of them, but it had to start somewhere. The next morning there was a knock at the door. Not hard, just 2 short taps, then stillness. I looked through the window expecting Green. It wasn't. It was a woman I didn't recognize. Late 30s maybe, holding a small box in her hands. I opened the door slowly. She looked up and said, "You don't know me, but I think my brother was on that list." I stepped aside and let her in. The box in her hands trembled as she set it on the table. "This is everything we kept from before he vanished," she said. Photos, drawings, even a tape from a church event. She looked at me, eyes red-rimmed. I didn't know who to give it to, but someone told me you'd understand. I opened the box and saw a photo right on top. A boy, maybe 10, standing in front of a paper tree cutout, wearing a blue sweater and a shy smile. On the bottom, in fading marker, Jonah's first nativity. I took a breath, then reached for the envelope beneath it. It was unopened, postmarked 2 weeks before he vanished. The return address was blurred, but the handwriting, it matched something I'd seen before. The curved tail on the letter J, the way the T's crossed low and firm. There was more in that box, but I didn't rush. I just sat there beside her, the woman who came knocking, and we let the silence speak for a while. Eventually, I asked if she remembered anyone named Paul. She nodded slowly once, then said, "He gave my brother a book that day. Told him he'd like the ending." She didn't say what the book was, and I didn't ask. Outside, the wind picked up again. Carried the leaves into the gutters, the kind that never get fully cleared. I looked down at the letter again, unopened, and thought not about what it might say, but about who else it might lead us to. They eventually found the man. Not in Akron, not in Indiana, but in a small rental property outside Harrisburg. He was going by the name Paul Martin again. When they brought him in, he didn't resist. Barely spoke, according to Green. Just kept asking for his books. I wasn't there when it happened, but I saw his photo later, older, grayer, ordinary, in a way that almost made me feel sick. There was no trial, at least not the kind people expect. The charges spanned too many jurisdictions, too many incomplete files. But there was enough. Enough for federal holding. Enough for the names to be read out loud. Enough for the silence to finally break. Lila never asked about what happened to him. She didn't need to. For her, the danger had already passed, at least the part with a face and a name. What remained was harder to name. The sound of a certain cough in public. The sharp, sudden fear when someone knocks twice. But she's healing. She draws more now. Mostly animals, trees, quiet places. Her therapist says it's a good sign. I think so too. Some afternoons, she hums to herself without realizing it. She's learning to trust the air again. Detective Green still checks in every so often. He told me Erin, the woman who first filed Caleb's report, is helping organize a new archive for cold cases connected to vanished youth programs. Detective Ellis transferred in to lead it. They're working with families now, cross-checking names, scanning every form that ever listed a P. Mercer or a missing church event sign-in sheet. None of this will bring the kids back. But it names them. It remembers them. And maybe that's where justice begins, even if it's slow. There's a shelf in my closet now. Just a simple wooden one painted blue where I keep a small folder. Inside are copies of the cards, photos of the hallway, the letter Lila never opened but kept anyway. On the back, in her own handwriting, she wrote, "I didn't forget." She doesn't need to explain what she meant. Some things are enough, just being said. I think about the woman who came to our door, the one holding Jonah's box. I think about the others who might still be waiting to speak to understand what happened to someone they loved. We're told stories about closure like it's a single door that shuts cleanly. But it's not like that. It's quieter. It happens in pieces. In phone calls returned in names entered into records that once left them out in the way someone finally says, "I believe you." Sometimes I wonder how many more boxes are still sitting in basements, closets, attics, filled with drawings, postcards, fragments of lives interrupted. And I wonder who's brave enough to open them. If this story stayed with you, maybe take a moment to remember someone whose name might have gone missing. Speak it aloud or share this story, so no one is left wondering alone.